in this video, so I'm just going to tell you in advance that a few of my subscribers, or at least people who watch my videos, have mentioned that my videos are a little bit lengthy. I guess the reason is I just want to try and cover everything that is on my mind in one video. So I'm going to be speaking about feminism, and it may seem I'm a little bit obsessed by this issue because a lot of my videos are about this subject, but perhaps one reason for that is I tend to write about topical subjects, and it seems that pretty much every day is there's another issue connected with feminism, whether it be a political party using feminist language, or whether it be a feminist campaign or whatever. So you may know yesterday was International Women's Day, and apologies if I'm slurring a bit, by the way. I've got an ulcer on my tongue which is quite painful. And I made a video about that, and I mentioned that I support the principle. But obviously that got a lot of sort of damn it, this is painful. I'm sorry. A little bit hard to speak when it's like an ulcer at the tip of my tongue. Anyway, today I've had a few debates with women who I guess would call themselves feminists. The first one I was in the context of having to defend myself because the person just made a sweeping statement that I must be a misogynist git. What I'd actually written was basically asking why men's issues aren't being covered in the particular movement that she had posted about. This was on a mutual group that we're in, and I resented her calling me that, so I went into got a little bit defensive. And the thing is, it's basically like being called misogynist is a little bit like being branded a racist or a homophobe. It's a very powerful slur, and as soon as you label someone in that way, it's, you know, you have to defend yourself, because then others look at it and they believe it, and you're branded with this sort of label. Now, it's not like I've never called people names when I think that it's been the case, but it also just reminded me of just how narrow feminist logic is sometimes, and I do find it quite difficult to debate feminists. Not all the time. I've been in more mature debates, but quite often when you try to raise points and you try to engage in debate, that's what happens. It ends up being reduced to a petty mudslinging contest. Now, to be fair, some critics of feminism are equally guilty of lowering the debate by just coming out with things like, oh, you're a man hater, or something like this. I don't think that's particularly helpful. I don't think it's the best way to engage with feminists. What I'd like to do in this video is reach out to feminists, moderate feminists, and I'll explain what I mean by that in a minute, but also just raise a few other points. First and foremost, I want to make something very clear. I strongly believe that people do not have to call themselves a certain thing just to prove that they believe in something. They shouldn't identify themselves with a certain movement or ideology just to prove a point. So I made this analogy earlier. I believe in workers' rights. I believe that workers have a right in the workplace to be paid fairly and so on. But does that mean I'm going to call myself a socialist? No. Yet that would be something that would be traditionally associated with socialism. I regard myself as pretty conservative on crime. I believe I get very angry when I see that serious crime doesn't result in proportionate punishment. So some will call that a conservative position, but I don't call myself a conservative. And the analogy I was making with feminism is that I do believe in women's rights and equal rights, but that doesn't mean I should have to call myself a feminist to prove it, because I think that would be disingenuous when I see a lot of flaws with the movement. So I deeply resent this very arrogant notion that if you don't label yourself in a certain way, then you're automatically opposed to all the thinking in the movement. I'm not opposed to all feminist thinking. I do take a big issue with the way feminism is right now, and I stand by everything I've said, but that doesn't mean I'm absolutely opposed to everything that they're saying. I'm just opposed to a lot of the double standards, the negative messages that they constantly send out. And by they, I should say I'm talking about the movement. That's a point that's worth mentioning, actually. When I say the movement, it becomes a bit complex, because on one hand, feminists complain, well, you can't just generalize all feminism as being one and the same. But on the other hand, if you represent your perception of what egalitarianism is, then they'll say, no, there's only one type of feminism. Well, if that is the case, then it is actually making feminism look very narrow-minded, very insular, rather than being this multifaceted general movement for egalitarianism, which I would say that broader feminism should be. But when I criticise this, what I am principally focusing on is the way Western feminism has become, and I think a lot of my criticism is quite apparent. I do think it is characteristic that there is a problem with freedom of expression when it comes to feminist forums and trying to have a dissenting voice, because there is an automatic perception that if you have a dissenting view, then that somehow means that you have a problem with equality, and I really take issue with that. I think one of the debates I was in today, one of the more mature debates, was that we do know that men went through all this stuff, that men had to die in world wars and so on, but that shouldn't be used as an excuse to bring women down. Now, that person missed the point I was making. Her perception was that I was raising the fact that men have also struggled in history simply as a point that feminists often ignore. Her perception was that I was raising that as an excuse to keep women down. No, absolutely not. I have no desire to keep women down. And this is the sort of victimhood mentality that I've mentioned before. When you're trying to debate with people who automatically believe that they're a victim, as many feminists frankly do, then it's very difficult to really get anywhere, because everything you say will be perceived as the oppressor talking down to the oppressed. Now, as a man, I cannot change my gender, and as someone who is critical of many aspects of modern day feminism, I'm going to stand by my guns, even if it means being unpopular. So that puts me in a somewhat difficult position, because, and I'm sure a lot of other people can relate to this that take issue with feminism, you're trying to go up against a very powerful movement that actually does have a big monopoly in large segments of the media. That's a fact. And I just would like to see an end of this perception that if you question feminism, then you're against equality. Maybe it's because feminists get very defensive about the movement that they support. I suppose you could say the same with socialists and conservatives would get defensive if there was accusations made against their thinking. Okay, so perhaps it's the same thing. But the difference is other ideologies, even themselves, sort of generally recognise that in a democracy they're not above criticism. So most socialists, most liberals and most conservatives are probably open-minded enough to realise that there is a scope for debate. They may disagree with people, they may stand by their convictions, but there is a scope for debate. When it comes to feminism, there is no scope for debate, because there is this automatic assumption that this movement is somehow in a bubble, it's above criticism. And that frankly infuriates me, because it's so narrow-minded. It kills freedom of expression, it kills off adult conversations and debate about this, and it just means that it's this very obnoxious movement that continues to promote its negativity and seems to think it is above scrutiny, and I'm fed up with it. And it's not just a case that I suspect other men are. I think a lot of women are increasingly getting fed up with it as well, because they might see it as patronising, or they respect men and they don't feel they want to be represented by a movement that is so divisive. Now, I want to also at this point say that I do differentiate between feminism the movement and feminists as people. I really don't believe that individual feminists are man-haters, and there's a lot of things that individual feminists say that I don't necessarily disagree with. But in fact, literally before making this video, I replied to a comment on, I don't know if it was one of my videos or just something that I commented on. Now, the girl that was speaking there, I found that actually we had a lot of our thinking wasn't that different. But then I gave up, because then she started getting to this idea that I couldn't criticise feminism. She was basically saying, oh yeah, I know all about all these men's issues and so on, I agree with you on that, but you shouldn't criticise this movement. Now my thinking is, why the hell not? What the hell gives feminism this golden dome where it is above criticism? Just because traditionally it was a progressive movement that really was about basic human rights, women's right to suffrage and so on, and that was a very important thing, and I've always said we need to recognise the important role that early feminism has played, doesn't mean that the movement is above criticism. And if you're a man and you criticise feminism, you're going to automatically be branded. You're going to be branded a misogynist, you're going to be branded a militant MRA. By the way, I'm not an MRA, because I've argued this as well before, that I think some of the men's rights movements are just as divisive and unhelpful. There's a new political party in the UK, a very small one around Nottingham, called Justice for Men and Boys. I was intrigued by this and I checked it out, but a lot of their platform seems to be basically the opposite side of the coin. It's all about male victimhood and how terrible things are for men, and how these terrible feminists are keeping us all down. And whilst I understand a lot of the resentment behind that, some of the policies are just nutty, and frankly just as bad as the sort of things that feminists come out with. Some of the policies in this group, for example, were introducing male-only schools, and they have on their website, for example, material on how women lie about rape and this sort of thing. That's unhelpful. Why? Because it's the sort of thing that gives legitimate men's rights issues a bad image. Now, one of the problems I have with that sort of platform is that if you're saying that women lie about rape without acknowledging that rape really does happen, then all that's going to do is make it look like you're basically condoning it. And that is despicable, because it is a real crime. It does happen, and women are legitimate victims very often. So that's a problem I have with certain men's rights movements. You know, the truth is, I'm just nauseated with this constant gender battle. And I would say one thing though, the reason that men's rights movements have been more vocal in recent years is as a response to militant feminism. They felt no other choice but to form those sort of movements. Now, that doesn't mean I entirely endorse them. Like I say, some of the approaches they use are wrong, but I can understand why it's happened, because there are a lot of men who really do feel that their concerns are being ignored. How often is it we see political parties saying, we're listening to what women voters want, or we're a party that cares about women? That's great. How about a party that focuses on the other 50% of the population? And I noticed, for example, the British Labour Party, a lot of women actually replied to those sort of posts and say, actually, I'm not identified because I'm a woman, I'm a human being, I'm an individual. And it's almost treating women like protected species, and it's absurd. If I was a woman, I would honestly find that rather patronising. And as a man, I find it insulting to insinuate that I'm part of this overbearing, patriarchal, privileged group. because the reality is just not the case. Now, my own life isn't that bad. I'm not going to play the victimhood card either. My own life is not that bad. But there are other men out there who are going through a very, very difficult time. And in many cases it is because of their gender. Why are issues like that not being talked about? Why is it political parties won't touch them? It pisses me off. And when there is a perception that things are being ignored, then of course you're going to get fringe groups that are angry and try to draw attention, and sometimes they use extreme methods because they really feel no other choice. A lot of MRA groups have tried to go down the diplomatic path. They've lobbied politicians, but it hasn't worked. So whilst I don't agree with everything they say, I do understand why it's happened. And they've had to listen to decades of feminist, frankly at times hate mongering, and this is a natural response. I will say one thing, to any, I mentioned the term moderate feminists earlier. The reason I feel the need to use that terminology is because I don't want to dismiss all feminists as one and the same, because I don't believe they are. When I'm talking about moderate feminists, what I'm referring to is women or men who identify themselves as feminists but are open-minded enough to agree that the movement is flawed, who are open-minded enough to agree that the movement is not above criticism, and who are open-minded enough to accept that there are legitimate grievances that men have. Look, I really, really have no problem with women or men who stand up for women's rights issues. I really don't have a problem with that, and I've frequently done it myself. I've seen things that have sickened me in terms of human rights abuses against women. I've signed petitions, I've shared information. I'm not saying I've done any more than anyone else, but the point I'm trying to get at here is in no way am I opposed to women's rights. But for people like me who have spoken out against third wave feminism, there has been no other choice but to be on the defensive, because you get demonized if you dare stand up against it. And that does make me angry. It makes me angry that this movement is so aggressive and so narrow-minded and so hostile to free expression. Because believe me, given half a chance, there are feminist lobby groups who really would shut down debate. And they really would make it a criminal offence for men to even have an opinion that contradicts their thinking. I'm adamant about that. I really do believe that a lot of it is about control. Controlling how people think. And I just think it's very unfortunate. For me, this is all really sometimes depressing, because I know what the reality is. I know what I believe in. And I just wish that some feminists could be a lot more open-minded than they are. Another thing, though, I would appeal to feminists watching this. Okay, if you really want to insist that the movement is about egalitarianism, okay. And if you really are about egalitarianism, I take my hat off to you, if I was wearing a hat. I'm not opposed to everything that you're saying. There are a lot of legitimate women's rights issues out there, and legitimate men's rights issues. And if you personally are trying to be more inclusive in your rhetoric and so on, that's great. But one thing I have noticed is a lot of feminists get very defensive and blame the negative perception that feminism has on everyone but the movement itself. You cannot blame outsiders for the negative perception that feminism has. That's wearing thin. You need to really, really look at this and think, well, why does it have such a negative perception if it's just about equality? You can't just blame it on angry MRAs, because angry MRAs barely have a voice. You can't just blame it on the media, because feminist lobbies have a very big influence on the media. You can't blame it on political parties, because whilst the situation that you want to say may not be perfect, the rhetoric that is being used is clearly in favour of feminism. So, when all those excuses are unthing, you have to look in the mirror, so to speak. And if you really, really are an egalitarian person, and if you really do acknowledge that, for example, men have issues as well, then you need to start being a lot more vocal in condemning misandry within feminism. For an example, if you see a feminist try to shout down a man or a woman simply for having a slightly dissenting point of view, if you truly believe in what you're saying, you should be jumping in there and saying, wait a second, we should be more open-minded in this, let's hear what they have to say. Let's debate them. If we agree with them, let's agree with them. But let's not shout them down. Let's not demonise them as a misogynist when they're not making any sort of misogynist opinion. Now, this is different from actual misogyny. You know, guys who say things like, oh, women should know their place, that sort of thing. And I'm not disputing that that exists. What I'm getting at is the fact that there are far too many feminists who have no tolerance of any views other than those that are exactly correlating to their own. I've seen this time and time again. So as a movement, I think feminism is incredibly narrow-minded. I do think it's an insular movement. You know, you could say there's different feminist movements, but the point here is the most vocal one is the one that is largely with a negative perception. Now, the Emma Watson He for She campaign probably had good intentions, although personally I feel it was more a publicity stunt. But, you know, I guess it's better than saying men are the problem. Nevertheless, it's going to take a lot more than that. It's going to take feminists actively taking on other feminists. And what I'm talking about with that is, I'm talking about moderate feminists who don't hate men, who acknowledge there are men's rights, and who are truly egalitarian, actually focusing on some of the very negative attitudes within the movement. Until you start focusing on that, and until you start focusing, by the way, on the double standards that are rampant within the movement, then you can't really complain about the movement having a bad image. You can't force people to respect it. It's your responsibility. If you're going to call yourself a feminist, it's your responsibility to think of why the movement has a bad image. And it isn't just the media, it isn't just angry MRAs. It's generally a bad perception. So I think, I mean, personally, I would like to have a situation whereby there was something that really, really, really was a unifying movement between men and women. I'm so sick and tired of these constant gender battles, because probably over half of my friends are women. Women have played a big role in my life. I was going to say I love women, but that would be a sweeping statement, you know. I don't like every woman. But sometimes people who criticise feminism have to say that, because hardcore feminists will portray them as woman haters. Just as some hardcore MRAs portray all feminists as man haters, which is, I think, is unfair and not accurate. But my final message is this: if you're a feminist, I don't hate you, okay? I'm sure that you're a decent person. I'm sure that some of what you believe that I will find common ground with. But I will say that it is your responsibility to focus on the flaws within the movement, rather than always being defensive and complaining about the negative perception, because it is coming from somewhere. You know, I actually saw one group online saying, it was actually about satirising the group Women Against Feminism, and the introduction to that group was, I'd started this because I was genuinely baffled there was a group called Women Against Feminism. Well, instead of being genuinely baffled, maybe you need to consider why, and maybe you actually need to read some of the comments that are in that group to see the background of this. Because the fact of the matter is, and I've said this before, you ask someone in the street, do they believe in equality, basic equality between men and women? I really do believe 80-90% of the people will say, yeah, sure. Ask the same question, well, not the same question, ask, do you consider yourself a feminist? Probably it would be something like 20 or 30%. Probably very few men, and probably only half or less of women. Why? If feminism is such a good movement, why does it have that perception? Anyway, I've spoken for quite a long time now. I do apologise for that, but I wanted to throw in everything that I believe is relevant. a final point. I don't hate feminists, and I'm very willing to engage in debate with feminists who are not going to demonise me simply for having my views. I'm willing to have a mature adult debate and address some of these points, and I'm not actually opposed to all feminist thinking. I'm really not. But I don't believe that I should have to call myself a feminist, or that I should have to respect the feminist movement just to prove a point. If you can relate to anything I'm saying, please feel free to say so. If you are a feminist and you think, well, actually I agree with a lot of what this guy's saying, but maybe not entirely, that's fine. If you're a feminist and you think that I'm wrong about something, please feel free to explain why. I'm not going to bother allowing any comments that are attacking myself, because I don't think I should give a platform to people who already have a lot of platform out there. I will stop talking now. Thank you for watching.